Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Harrington, Commissioners. I'm Sheriff Pat Garrett, and I'm here today with Dr. Jonathan Wender, who is the President and CEO of Polo Solutions. He has 20 years of public safety experience as a public safety officer and also as a social scientist. With him is Denise Rodriguez, a nationally recognized expert in police reform and accountability, and she's a senior program analyst with Polo Solutions. Slide, please. I will soon hand the baton over to Dr. Wender and Ms. Rodriguez, but it's worth reviewing that, summer of 2020, we conducted a competitive process to find national experts in police use of force to conduct an independent review of our use of force policies, procedures, training, operational administrative matters, really in order to ensure that we were aligned with best practices. And if we were aligned, it's still enormously valuable because we would be more strongly aligned as a result of that review and the outcomes of that review. We believed that it would facilitate a deeper engagement with internal and external stakeholders about police use of force, which is probably the most consequential action, right, police undertake. And it's enormously important in the community. And when you build community trust, to do that in a way that minimizes force, is thoughtful about when that force is used, it's proportional, et cetera, and to foster community trust and safety. It aligns with our vision, and it also supports our commitment to be a learning organization focused on continuous improvement. I also think it's noteworthy to just say out loud that an independent review like this has never been done before at the Sheriff's Office. And we took it upon ourselves and just took the initiative to make this happen for our community and for our organization. And with that, I would ask to advance the slide, and I would invite Dr. Wender and Ms. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Sheriff. I appreciate the kind introduction. Commissioners, audience members, good afternoon. It's our honor and pleasure to be with you today and to have this dialogue with you presenting our final report and recommendations. I'm going to take you through a few slides, hand the baton off to Denise, but I think the most important part of our presentation today will be the dialogue that we hope will follow the presentation and set conditions for what we are confident will be a productive process involving you, the Sheriff's Office, and diverse members of the community. Next slide, please. Before I go into the report, I just want to give you a little bit of background on Polo Solutions, on me and Denise and the other members of our team. I think it's important for you to know a little bit about the folks with whom you entrusted this critical project and the taxpayers' hard-earned money. We're a national technology research and training company, and we love what we do, and I choose the word with care. We are deeply committed to the idea that trust is safety and safety is trust. We are a diverse team of folks with backgrounds in science, technology, policing, and a range of other fields. And we work as hard as we can to try to figure out how to develop rock-solid science-based solutions to help communities build trust and safety. We're passionate about what we do, and we're most interested in trying to build and implement programs that allow serious, sustainable reform. And you'll hear me talk a little bit later about what I call the police reform merry-go-round, where there is a quick, spasmodic, and I would say sometimes theatrical response to crisis, which inevitably evaporates into the ether. Denise and I and our entire team have been delighted that Washington County does not fall into that category. We've been impressed with the energy, tenacity, and vision that we've seen and are encouraged that conditions are right in Washington County for continued evolution of an already very strong agency. Next slide, please. A bit about me. Before I say anything else, I want to say unequivocally and on the record, any errors, omissions, problems with this report are my fault and my fault alone. So if anything in here you don't like or disagree with or think is incorrect or inaccurate, that's Jonathan Wender's fault. I usually describe myself as a philosopher cop. I have a deep passion for what happens when people see each other face to face. I'm especially interested in situations where risk is high and trust is low. I spent 20 years as a police officer in the Seattle area, and as a social scientist, I'm interested in understanding on a larger scale how to improve face-to-face interactions. I founded Polo Solutions with my colleagues with the goal of trying to provide some of the best and most rigorous and creative insights we could develop into how to improve the quality of American policing. I'm going to yield to Denise to introduce herself, and then I'll talk a bit about the folks on our team who are not with us this evening. Denise, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jonathan. So again, my name is Denise Rodriguez. A bit of my background. So in addition to working alongside Jonathan on a couple of projects like this one, I'm currently the Chief Deputy Monitor on the Puerto Rico Consent Decree. My background is in research, but over the last 13 years or so, I've worked with a number of agencies across the country on issues related to reform, such as use of force, internal investigations, training, civilian oversight, accountability, and community engagement. And I look forward to sharing our work with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. In alphabetical order, Dr. Mark Brown. Mark is an Air Force veteran, began his career with the Charleston Police Department. Mark grew up in Charleston, has a particular passion for improving the way the police department serve communities of color. Mark is a nationally recognized expert on police use of force and constitutional policing. And in addition to working with Polo, serves on the faculty at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, FLETC, in Glencoe, Georgia. Sergeant Don Gula is retired from the King County Sheriff's Office in the Seattle area. Don served for almost 35 years. I've known Don since he was my defensive tactics instructor in the academy back in 1990. Don has a national reputation for his work on de-escalation, for integrating de-escalation and mental health training with use of force and negotiations training. Margaret Horner is one of our program managers. Margaret has her master's degree from Seattle University and has expertise in managing programs on community policing and de-escalation, primarily funded by the federal government. Mr. Thomas Larned is a retired senior executive from the FBI. Tom served for nearly 30 years with the FBI. He spent quite a bit of time in the FBI's Inspector General Unit, where he was responsible for overseeing implementation and compliance with high liability policies across the FBI and its field offices. Tom also spent time in Canada as the FBI's attaché and was deployed to Iraq after Operation Iraqi Freedom to support the development of policing and intelligence in Iraq in alignment with human rights and the rule of law. Finally, Trak Silapaduriang. Trak immigrated to the United States from Thailand as a child, grew up in Chicago, went on to join the Chicago Police Department. He served in Chicago for 20 years and is the department's lead expert witness on use of force. When Chicago has litigation of any kind, especially federal on use of force, Trak testifies on behalf of the city and is also the city's lead for developing training on de-escalation and force mitigation and constitutional policing. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about the mandate for our report. We were delighted to be selected for this effort. And going back now to the summer of 2020, our mandate is to take a global look at the 35,000 foot level and much lower than that at anything and everything within the sheriff's office having to do with the use of force. That's policies, procedures, how the sheriff's office trains deputies in patrol and jail divisions. If it has to do with the use of force, we looked at it. I want to be clear in saying that we did not have the mandate to examine individual use of force events. Our purpose rather is to look overall at use of force, how people are trained to deal with it, how they address it on the street, and what happens in the aftermath. Being social scientists, we used a range of different methods to conduct the study. We interviewed several dozen members of the sheriff's office of all ranks, from the sheriff down to some newer employees. We also interviewed a number of stakeholders in the community. I will say we did not get to interview as many folks in the community as we would have hoped. There were a number of people to whom we reached out and we were unsuccessful in reaching. With that said, I do think we were able to reach a good cross-section and hear a good representative number of voices. We convened some focus groups, one of which we were able to actually do, fortunately, in person at a training conference in St. Louis earlier last year. We reviewed hundreds and hundreds of documents, which we greatly appreciate the Sheriff's Office for sharing in such a timely fashion. We conducted some surveys. And finally, despite all of the wrenches thrown into things by COVID, we were able to make a visit to the Sheriff's Office in June that was compliant with all the health regulations in effect at the time. As the Sheriff already mentioned, an invited elective review of the kind we have just completed is quite unusual, and all things being equal, it indicates a healthy organization. We work with organizations of all kinds. We've worked with some of the smallest police departments in the country, and we've worked with the biggest ones. Some of these organizations are very healthy. They have the benefit of low crime and strong community support. Others are racked by violence and mistrust and long legacies of animosity between the police department and the community. Fortunately, we saw none of that in Washington County. We did not anticipate the challenges of COVID when this project began, but I don't think any of us anticipated the onset of COVID, let alone how long it would be with us. But I do feel confident that we've been able to navigate around the impact of COVID, and that the outcome of this report has not in any way been compromised or limited by our inability to do things as quickly or as much on site as we would have wished. Next slide, please. I want to offer some background, and here I'm going to channel both my own police experience and my background as a social scientist. We are, as everybody in this meeting knows, at an inflection point in American policing. We are at a time when community trust in many parts of the country is at a low water mark. We are at a time when police frustration, anxiety, and sometimes even suicidal depression are at a high water mark. So across the country, we're seeing unprecedented conditions that call for creativity and integrity and rigor in addressing the challenges of police reform. There's no issue more consequential in this conversation than the use of force. And I want to say my own personal opinion, however utopian and idealistic one might be, and I am, I think, a fairly hopeful person, nonetheless, there will always be times and places when the police will have to use force, tragically, sometimes even deadly force, to protect peace and social order, to protect human life. No statistics that we or anybody else gather can capture the paradox at the center of society's fraught relationship with the police. The relationship is this: society entrusts people like the deputies of the Washington County Sheriff's Office. They trust them with the power to decide the meaning of the Constitution on dark street corners in the middle of the night. And they give them guns and badges, hoping they'll never have to use those guns. At the same time, when the police do use force, we're shocked, we're frightened, and we're sometimes even offended. And I actually find that response of shock and dismay a positive one, because it signals we're a society where violence is rare. Violence is not the coin of the realm. Violence is not the norm. But I think it's very important to recognize that force will never go away, limit it or regulate it, though we will try. We can change policies and we can change procedures. That's pretty easy. At the end of the day, the hardest thing to do in any organization, police departments, sheriff's offices being no exception, changing culture and behavior is far more challenging. As both a police officer, a member of society, as a taxpayer, as an academic, I long ago wearied of police reform initiatives that are superficial and theatrical and accomplish nothing. So my colleagues and I have set out with this project to give to the Sheriff's Office a list of actionable recommendations that we are confident can make a measurable, real difference in the way in which the Sheriff's Office interacts with the community and interacts internally. At the end of the day, there's nothing more important than trust. You would not have given us the opportunity to complete this project if you didn't trust in us. We hope we have honored that trust. At the end of the day, trust is the trump card that will determine the success or failure going forward of anything and everything the Sheriff's Office endeavors to do. Next slide. Let me talk a little bit about some of our key findings, and then I'm going to hand things off to Denise to go through the recommendations, and then I hope we'll have a good question and answer session. Everybody wants to know when we do these reports, how much force does our department use? To no surprise, use of force by patrol deputies in Washington County is far below the national average. There's a lot of research on this, but roughly speaking, on a national scale, in most police agencies, about 1 to 3 out of 100 contacts result in some use of force. And most of those uses of force are fairly low. In Washington County, deputies use force about once out of every 250 or 260 contacts. So that's about 0.4%. The patterns of force that we saw are unsurprising. Most use of force in Washington County on the road involves deputies responding to violent incidents at night in some of the sheriff's offices' busier patrol districts. So no surprises there. In the jail, as you probably know from reading reports from the sheriff, the Washington County Jail averages about 18,000 bookings a year and about 500 or so uses of force annually. COVID for both Washington County and every other correctional facility with which we've had dealings has posed some monumental challenges. Being in jail is stressful for the folks in custody, and it's certainly stressful for the employees working to serve them and keep them and themselves safe. The restrictions imposed by COVID, as well as the higher security levels of many of the folks in custody at Washington County Jail, appears to have attributed to an increase in use of force. Some of the details of this are in our report. We are confident that once COVID restrictions tail off, when it's appropriate for those to happen, when the security level of adults in custody balances out to historical levels, we expect that use of force will tail off. Before I hand it off to Denise, I want to talk about the things that impressed us most in our conversations. As I mentioned earlier, and again, it's no surprise to any of you, the level of tension between law enforcement and communities is at an all-time high. And sadly, we're accustomed to hearing when we travel around the country a lot of anger and resentment and animosity from law enforcement officers who wonder aloud why they're enduring the animosity, anger from communities that they are. I have to say, and I've talked to many, many departments all around the country for many years, I'm hard pressed to think of an agency where deputies were as positive in their attitude toward the community. Time and time again, deputies spoke in admiring terms and gracious terms of the community and of what they think the community thinks of them and of what they think of the community. We heard anecdotes about deputies being off duty, running into people whom they put in jail, and being introduced to family members and having hands shaken. I'm not trying to sugarcoat tensions. I'm not trying to sugarcoat mistrust, but all things being equal, from what we saw, both the sheriff's office and the community have conditions favorable to implement sustained reform. And with strong trust, all is possible. That's true in individual relationships. It's true in relationships between law enforcement agencies and communities. The greatest impediment to change is culture. And we've laid out in some detail where we think the sheriff's office can go in trying to take an agency level and frankly, even a national level role in setting standards for cultural change. So with those general background remarks in mind, I'm going to turn the floor over to Denise for a review of our recommendations. Denise, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Can we go to the next slide? All right, so we developed 71 recommendations in 6 categories. These were use of force policy, use of force data analysis and tracking, use of force accountability, general operations, training and education, and use of force training. Each of these recommendations that we made varied in complexity, urgency, and cost, and that is what plays a big role in the next steps after our report is released and in prioritizing each of those recommendations. So next slide. A couple core things to highlight when we talk about our recommendations, and these are some of the underlying themes across many of the recommendations we made. Building a culture of necessity versus culture of permissibility. Now, this is something that many agencies across the country are grappling with. The idea of moving away from using force because it is allowed or permissible by law and policy to only using force when it is necessary. This is a culture shift in policing, and we're seeing it across the country. And like we mentioned before, we do see that the sheriff's office, their organizational values and their vision provide the foundation for making this cultural shift. Sanctity and dignity of human life as a practical foundation for use of force. This is something that should be weaved into all aspects of use of force, from policy to training to reviewing incidents of use of force. Some of the more pivotal recommendations in our report revolve around improvements to the use of force and other related policies. Another core highlight we recommend is systematically improving each deputy's capacity for adaptive decision-making. This is training deputies to slow down situations, empowering them to assess, lead, and evaluate each incident. Though we understand that not all incidents allow for this, training to this skill improves the deputy's ability to do this quickly and more successfully. Another theme that we want to highlight as well was the importance of using data to identify, analyze, and repeat patterns of success. Using use of force data, complaint data, as well as other data like body-worn camera footage is also important to creating a learning agency. And analyzing this data helps the agency determine if changes to policy or training are needed to address any underlying organizational issues. Next slide. So a couple of the key recommendations from our report. Again, our report is rather lengthy, so please take a look at the full report for all of the detail on our recommendations. This is just a quick overview. So what Jonathan and I would call the most important recommendation is to work purposefully to build trust on every contact. The foundation for this is already part of the Sheriff's Office vision, but reinforcing this in policy, training, and practice will ultimately lead to the shift in the culture of the agency. We're also recommending that as the Washington County Sheriff's Office begins to implement these recommendations, that they work closely with both internal and external stakeholders, so both officers and the community, to gather input and work towards implementing some of the recommendations. These efforts should be transparent, and the Sheriff's Office should also ensure that any changes they make are sustainable in the long run. So things like cost, training, staffing, et cetera, need to be considerations in the discussion and in developing the plan and strategy for implementing the recommendations. Another item I bring up to agencies is the importance of institutionalizing these changes in policy. This ensures continuity even where there are changes in leadership. The ultimate goal is to avoid, as Jonathan likes to call it, the police reform merry-go-round. We don't want the Sheriff's Office or its community to be back here in need of another evaluation in 2 to 3 years. So before I pass it back to Jonathan for Q&A, I do just want to reiterate something that was said at the beginning of the presentation, and Jonathan reiterated it. So I've worked with several police agencies on reform issues, and it certainly has been refreshing for me to work with an agency that has been open to having an honest and sometimes tough conversation around what needs to change and how they could improve. This willingness to look internally, even when it may be a little painful, goes a long way in terms of changing the culture of an agency and increasing accountability. Jonathan, I'll pass it off to you to facilitate Q&A.
Thanks, Denise. So I'm just going to offer a few more quick remarks, and then we're really looking forward to your questions. We have some suggested questions here. We would like to clarify what we can explain better. We'd love to hear what we missed. We want to know how we can help. And really the capstone of all of this will be 2 workshops, one internal for the Sheriff's Office and one with community stakeholders. To go back to where I began, we've truly been impressed by the level of candor and idealism within the Sheriff's Office. I always tell people I think you get to make fun of any group to which you belong. So I make fun of cops, I make fun of academics, and I make fun of guys from New Jersey who talk too much. But I do want to say that in police departments, cops can be backbiting, they can be backstabbing, they can gossip, they can complain. We saw none of that at the Sheriff's Office. Our interviews were confidential, they were anonymous. Even in those conversations, we heard dissent, we heard disagreement, we heard criticism, but it was always respectful. And that signals to me that conditions are right for positive change. The road ahead is not easy. But all things being equal, it's certainly easier for the Washington County Sheriff's Office than it is for some of the other agencies we work with that are sometimes under federal consent decree, that are facing rampant violence, a massive exodus of personnel, and a range of other issues. So without further ado, I'm going to listen for your questions, and hopefully Denise and I can answer them. Any that are outside our purview, we'll respectfully ask the sheriff to answer for us.
Sheriff Garrett, before I go through the first round for all 5 of us to ask questions or make comments, is there anything you would like to highlight for us?
Thank you for asking, Chair Harrington. I just want to highlight our staff. They leaned into this project. They're like, hey, let's do it. Let's bring in this group. Let's show them what we got. Let's find out where we're strong and where we need to improve. And they were fearless about that. And even now, as we have implemented our first deadline for a run through of the recommendations for that first list of where should we focus our energies first, we're getting some terrific feedback. So I just want to compliment them for their courage to be good partners in this effort. We learned they're already hitting the mark in some.
You bet. Well, it's great to have an exemplary organization and one that is accredited as well. So, all right, commissioners, first round of questions and comments, and there may only be one round. We'll see. Who would like to go first? Go ahead, Commissioner Willie.
Yeah, thank you, Sheriff, and certainly Jonathan and the team. This is great. I was trying to understand 508 uses per year of use of force. So could you give me a little bit more clear definition of what activity falls into a use of force versus what doesn't?
Yes, sir. So I'm just going to give you a very brief answer, and the sheriff can speak with greater authority and precision than I can about the actual parameters for use of force reports. But in Washington County, everything above compliant cuffing counts as a use of force. So if a deputy handcuffs somebody, that's not a use of force. But if there's any touching beyond merely, for example, guiding someone to a patrol car, that constitutes a use of force. We saw at Washington County what we see nationally, which is that almost all use of force is at a low level. It's basically pushing, pulling, it's people struggling not to be handcuffed. And the sheriff's office each year issues a use of force report, which I know goes to all of you, which details the number of each type of use of force used, wrestling matches, so to speak, versus tasers versus batons and so on. And Sheriff, I'll defer to you to fill in some specifics there that I may have missed about your parameters.
Thank you, Commissioner Willie, Dr. Wender. Yes, Dr. Wender, he's right. He's right on the money. It's anything above compliant handcuffing. It could be an escort hold if somebody is intoxicated or not complying, right? And in the jail, so we're there 24 hours a day with pre-COVID, almost 570 adults in custody. So that averages out to be less than 2 use of force events a day, which, given the population, given the size of our jail, that's, I can absolutely live with that, provided that we are making every effort to limit that use of force to when it is necessary, just like Jonathan and Denise had described earlier. I will say that since COVID, our average daily population of Measure 11 offenders, for example, has increased 250%. These are people who are charged with the most serious person crimes that you can face because of the court slowdown. Our assaults on deputies have increased 130% from 2020 to 2021. The total assaults on deputies. So we are managing through, because of COVID, a very challenging population, and we're just keeping a close eye on that. But yes, thank you for the question, Commissioner. That's super helpful.
Commissioner,
well, maybe
if I could just, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Jonathan.
Oh, Commissioner, I had just a quick follow-up remark that you and your colleagues may find helpful in in understanding some of the numbers. There's, I think, an emotional and political tendency nationwide to magnify the use of force, especially rare catastrophic events. What we try to do is ask not just why they're catastrophic failures, but why most of the time, almost all the time, officers do the right thing. They get it right. So a big part of what we push agencies to do, and we lay this out in great detail in the report, we want to know why, specifically using data, why are deputies only using force a few hundred times out of several hundred, out of thousands and thousands of contacts? What are those patterns of success? How do we identify what's shaping them? And how do we systematically replicate them in selection, in hiring, in supervision, in training, in discipline, in coaching, and so on and so on. So I think there's sometimes a tendency with reform only to look at the failures. We have to look at the successes. And here's where Polis draws a lot from fields like aviation and medicine in looking at a wider range of data and not just taking a short-term political view at one or two events.
Yeah, and I guess I was trying to quantify that a little bit into like a first degree use of force versus a third degree use of force. And, I didn't see that in here, and I guess it doesn't make any difference, I guess. But anyway, it would just be, to me, knowledgeable or an understanding of the highest level of use of force that we have to, because those are the ones where we have not only our deputies at risk, but we are at risk in the lawsuit arena as well. So I was trying to get a better understanding of that. But that's okay. I understand that now, the definition of use of force, and that's very helpful. And then just one other question, and you have 71 recommendations in 6 categories. I've read those. They're really, really good. But when I first read 71 recommendations, I mean, you're giving them a glowing report in the first, and then you say we have 71 recommendations. I'm going, that doesn't seem to fit to me. Now that I hear you, that may have a better positive response. But I'd like to hear what what is normal and what is, if we're way above the mark here and just having only 71.
So I think the number of recommendations doesn't really correlate with the state of the agency. I think what it correlates with is the perfectionism and attention to detail that we have on our team. I would also say that because Washington County is a healthy, well-run organization, we are challenging you to make small changes in some areas that we might not ask other agencies to make. But I wouldn't look for any underlying significance in the number of recommendations. It's simply, as we looked across the organization, those are the things that we would recommend doing. And as Denise mentioned, the recommendations vary in urgency and cost. There are some things that we really think should be done. There are other things that would be nice to do, but we recognize it may take more time and more money and more deliberation. And Denise, I don't know if you have any further thoughts around that.
Thanks, Jonathan. And so I completely agree that we shouldn't necessarily make that correlation with like, oh, you've got 71 recommendations. That means the agency needs a lot of work. And I think in this instance, from our perspective, it was more about bringing the agency in line with best practices that are occurring across the country. And as we've seen over the last year or so, a lot of that is boosting use of force policies to include duty to intervene, duty to report. A lot of those pieces were what we recommended that the agency include in their policies that wasn't already there. So much of that, again, is just bringing in line their policies, their training practices, the way use of force are reported and tracked up to promising police practices.
And Commissioner, I just one more quick footnote, and I think as Denise was saying, in many cases, because the quality of deputy at Washington County is high, in some areas you've been getting by with policies that are a bit threadbare. In many of the agencies we work with, well, as I put it in a number of conversations with sheriff and executive staff, there are some agencies in the US that are struggling with quality employees, with hiring, with retention, with violent crime. many of these agencies, especially under agencies under consent decree, have rock solid, really good policies. What they don't have is enough qualified employees to execute on those policies. Washington County has the luxury of some really good deputies. A lot of what we're recommending is bring your policies into alignment with best practices, so that you're leaving nothing to the imagination. You're leaving nothing to litigation that could be addressed proactively now. So in many cases, we're just recommending that the sheriff's office formalize what's already enshrined in culture and informal practice.
Great, thank you. I don't have any more questions.
Other commissioners?
Sure, I can go. Yeah, thank you for the report. I guess I'm not terribly surprised. You get a gut feel about things, and I've always felt the department we all ran. And before Pat, we've had other, obviously sheriffs, and they've done a marvelous job as well. They've all built on each other's backgrounds. My questions are about three. One, with your definition of force, which is pretty broad. I mean, I understand why you do what you do, but it's pretty broad. What percentage of force incidents occur against our officers with your definition? You're saying that if I'm an officer and I touch somebody, that's use of force. What, flipping this other side of the coin, what percentage of the interactions are use of force against our officers? Do we know that?
So, Commissioner, I believe we do, and I know that we reviewed the sheriff's office's annual reviews of use of force of the hundreds of documents we received. Those annual summaries were among them, and those reports list in detail levels of resistance against deputies. And Sheriff, I would defer to you, sir, for particulars on that.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wender. Thank you, Commissioner Rogers. We do have those statistics. I'm sorry, I don't have them off the top of my head, but they are, it is an occupational risk, and deputies do get injured. They do get assaulted, and I'm happy to share those numbers. But we have those numbers.
Yeah, it might be helpful, Pat, because it. As you know, oftentimes what I've seen of your officers and other officers in other departments, that's an initiated reaction to somebody else who starts an interaction. So, when one says, well, we have all these use of force, my suspicion that it's at least as many reactions. I mean, you're reacting to somebody pushing you or somebody grabbing you. And so anyway, I'd be curious to know that. We've gained national awards in regards to our police activities, and I'm sorry, John, I don't know your organization real well. I certainly am impressed with the credentials and the people, the quality, and all that sort of thing. But is there some sort of a national accreditation that you do? I mean, you'd like to have that market, I'm sure. Say, I'm the only one in town that gives that accreditation, but how do we square up these findings with other kinds of reviews that we've had? How does this relate?
So, sir, as you know, the Sheriff's Office is already a CALEA accredited agency.
Okay.
CALEA is the accrediting body of record for U.S. law enforcement. Polo Solutions is not an accrediting body. I would think of it this way, sort of a rough analogy. When you buy a house, you get a qualified inspector to inspect the house and tell you that the house is sound, that everything's in working order, that it complies with code. It's hard to get a rock solid inspection on a house. Polis is the organization that comes in even to accredited agency and looks at a level that accreditors can't. We go much deeper into data. Our mandate is more narrow and laser-like than an accreditation team. So much like that beautiful house that's just passed inspection, there's always room for improvement. And an organization like Polis will find things that an inspection team from CALEA didn't. So what we're doing is something above and beyond that. And I think I would predict that if the sheriff's office implements a decent number of these recommendations, that your accreditation report will reflect that next time. You'll have an even smoother reaccreditation.
I appreciate that, because that leads to my third question, because in the profession I'm in, we have peer reviews, we have all kinds of standards international. What you're saying is that the national standard, which is a certain bar, I mean, everything's a bar, that you're digging a little deeper than that. And I appreciate that. Would the best practices that you're recommending be a little more for an organization that it's easier to review, like a Washington County, because of the high standards, than one that's less? And let me maybe frame that differently.
Sure.
I've done peer reviews in my profession before, and I know that somebody is not quite as tidy with their records, not as quite as good with their practices. The tone, as we call it, tone at the top, is not exactly the same. You have a little different, more guttural kinds of comments about you need to try these things. But when you get somebody that's good, where you can actually audit them and see what's going on, you lay, as your words, you laser points and say, boy, we could also do this. So do you think that the bar that Washington County was maybe subjected to, and I'm not saying it was as bad, I'm pleased, I'm glad you did it. It might be a little higher bar than a lot of other organizations.
So I would say so, Commissioner, and I'll offer a few remarks, and I want to yield to Denise on this one as well. So as I'm sure most or all of you know, one of the great challenges with American police reform is that there is not a set of national standards. Now, police departments, for example, there are basic constitutional standards departments have to follow. For example, the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution, other constitutional amendments. There are statutory guidelines and court rulings that apply to any and all law enforcement agencies. And use of force, that's rulings like Graham v. Connor. But at the end of the day, if somebody asks, well, how should we train or how should we hire? There is no definitive authoritative set of standards. So what Polis does, and organizations like us, we look across the nation, we look at research, we look at best practices in the field, and we draw from those to offer the recommendations that we do. But I certainly think it's easier to make recommendations to an agency that's relatively healthy than to one that's struggling. There are things, well, I'll just give you a couple of brief examples. When they're good examples, I'll name an agency. When they're not, I won't. But I remember one large East Coast agency with whose chief I met some years ago, and he said, we just started a new foot patrol program, but the community members really want the officers just actually start talking. And the same chief said, if I could just get officers to stop using the F word on contacts, half my complaints would go away. So that's a different bar from Washington County. We sometimes do training in use of force. We were doing some training in the Midwest for a mid-sized agency over the summer. And we were teaching officers how to safely and humanely get people in handcuffs. And someone said, oh, well, how come you're not kicking them in the head or doing this and doing that? We said, well, because that's brutal and illegal. We don't do that anymore in the year 2022. So there are a lot of things taken for granted at Washington County that sadly are not taken for granted everywhere in the country. And Denise, I'm sure you have some further thoughts here.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd want to add is just the willingness of the agency, Washington County, of the sheriff's office, to just open up everything, hand over whatever we needed. Definitely made our jobs a lot easier than my job has been in working with other agencies. So I certainly appreciate the willingness to just have those tough conversations. And there were tough conversations. But yeah, it certainly made our job a lot easier in that sense.
Thank you, Commissioner Rogers. Commissioner Treese, go ahead.
There. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's been really interesting and quite comprehensive. Can you talk to me, or to all of us, a little bit more about the community workshop? What I know, it's to be determined, but what are your concepts there? What have your experiences been? And what is the goal?
So, so Commissioner, thank you for the question. And I'm going to begin with your last point. Before we even started this project, as Denise, I already knew what our primary recommendation would be. And that recommendation is to deliberately and purposefully leverage every single contact as a way to build trust. I told Sheriff Garrett, I've told every police chief or sheriff I've ever worked with, it doesn't matter if you have a halo above your head, if you're the best chief or sheriff to ever walk the face of the earth, community trust in your agency is no better than your worst employee's last contact. That's where the bar sits. So what we want to do is take an opportunity with the community to bring together a diverse group of stakeholders, people, some of whom like the sheriff's office, some of whom don't, because it's especially important to get skeptics on side. It's very easy to get your cheerleaders in a room and to get them to nod and clap in approval. But as everybody on this call knows, whether it's Washington County or any other organization you've ever worked with, it's the skeptics you need to win over and whose trust you need to earn and keep. And this is why, when we began this project, I said to the sheriff, when we interview folks in your organization, the interviews will be anonymous and confidential, because I want to talk to people who don't like you. I want to talk to people who disagree with you. I want to meet the deputies who sit in the back of the room at roll call and fold their arms and mutter under their breath. I want to talk to those guys because I want to hear what they have to say. And similarly in the community, I don't just want the people who show up to the community events. I want the people who are skeptical, who are mistrustful, sadly, often with good reason. So the objective of a community workshop is to bring together community members and the sheriff's office and identify common ground, identify a starting point. Like the first time I met Denise was when we did a project like this in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which at the time was struggling with a spike in violence and gun crime, a long legacy of racial inequality, reinforced by biased policing practices. And one of the things we did in Fayetteville was convene a workshop where we brought together folks from across the community, everybody from convicted felons to the police chief. And we didn't try to paper over differences, but we said, okay, what can we at least agree on? Acknowledging each other's strengths and weaknesses, what can we agree on? And we agreed that something needed to be done about gun violence that was killing far too many young Black men. And that became our starting point. So this report, if you cut through all the research and all the language and all the jargon, all we're really trying to do is give you a long conversation starter to put in front of the community and say, community, we opened ourselves up to outside scrutiny. Here's the good stuff. Here's the bad stuff. We want you to be a part of the conversation because we serve you. And if you don't agree with what we're doing, if you don't trust us, it's all a waste of time and money. So we need to get you on side, community. Here are the things we think about doing. What do you think we should do? Looking at this report, what do you think we should do first and how should we do it? It's also an opportunity to educate. It's an opportunity to explain to the community why police work occurs the way it does. I always tell people I think police cars should be gray. They shouldn't be black and white because very, very little in policing is black and white. If policing were a matter of simple yes, no questions, I would be unemployed. It's murky, it's ambiguous, and it's tough. But getting the community involved is critical because when the relationship between the community is strong, when critical incidents occur, you've got money in the bank. And so it's building trust now is not only the right thing to do, it's in effect giving you an insurance policy. So when that next shooting occurs, when that next controversial incident occurs, people will say, you know what? I trust Sheriff Garrett and his deputies. They're okay men and women. They're good folks. Last time I got pulled over, I'm mad I got a ticket, but the deputy was kind of cool. Last time I was in jail, I was really mad I went to jail, but the deputy really listened to me, treated me with respect and dignity. So I bet the deputies were doing the right thing. That's what we're trying to do, is create a formal opportunity for building trust.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I'm just reflecting on the, on the issues that we've had, and region-wide in this community, and really thinking about how we can make sure that any community outreach is effective. We're getting, the community voices across the board, how we approach from the standpoint of equity and inclusion, those types of issues.
It is a challenge. We had a number of conversations with the sheriff around this issue. And we certainly met that challenge ourselves when about half the community members we wanted to interview, after repeated phone calls, emails, a lot of folks never called us back. And it is important to recognize, in building trust, often the people you want to reach are often reluctant to talk for any one of a host of reasons. Denise, you may have some thoughts here from other projects you've been involved in around how to execute on something like this.
No, I completely agree with you, Jonathan. I think the other thing to consider for the workshop as well is just reinforcing the importance of getting input from the community around what recommendations, the prioritization of those recommendations, where they see themselves being part of the discussion. So that workshop will hopefully start that conversation so that the sheriff can just take things from there and start moving on next steps, engaging folks where they need to be engaged. But certainly, I think that's a big part of the implementation, the sustainability of the recommendations.
Thank you. And like I said, I'm just, and Sheriff Garrett, I'm certain that your intention is to work with all the advisory committees that you have in place and currently, and with the equity office and all those folks as well. And I just want to make sure that we're proceeding with respect to the community and to our sheriff's office at the same time.
And Commissioner, I'm sure, I chose a team for this project that I think are some of the best and brightest in the country. I'm enormously proud of the folks on our team. We customize our team to each project, and part of what we tried to do right up front is build a team of people who didn't just have the expertise, but also the personal experience to empathetically understand concerns in Washington County. So in addition to being experts, the folks on this team get it, whether as street cops or members of various groups of humanity. We understand. And I think this report has to be credible at the public level. And we've tried to walk that tightrope. Because of course, we don't want, we can't be cheerleaders for sheriff's office, nor can we be irrational critics.
Thank
you. We need to be mindful of the time. Commissioner Fye, how about you?
Thank you, Chair Harrington. Thank you, Dr. Wender and Ms. Rodriguez and Sheriff Garrett. This is a great report, and I really appreciated this conversation, and I think it was really inspiring and really positive conversation, and I hope a lot of community tune in, or we can get this portion of the conversation to spread it out and put it on our social media. Usually conversations around law enforcement, it's not, I haven't seen this inspiration of and the dynamics of how we address the positive and the negatives of law enforcement. I have two questions, maybe not two questions, but I'm interested to hear more of your take on two areas. Use of force on data analysis in the tracking section, and then also use of force of the internal accountability section. And I'm interested to see if you saw, if you disaggregated that data for demographics, first of all, and then if you saw a disparity in the, for one, the recipients of use of force. I'm really just interested in see if there's any of that. And I think community and folks listening in will really benefit your take on that. And then also the same for the internal accountability piece. of that, if there was disparity of folks who, you know, were recipients of use of force, how many of that were held accountable? So those are two questions, and I'll mute myself because my kid is right here
No,
listening. So.
thank you, Commissioner. As a parent, I certainly understand. So we, as far as racial or other demographic disparities in force, we relied on the sheriff's office's own collected data and self-reported data. In that data, we did not notice any disparities. The use of force data closely aligns with the demographics of Washington County. And so we did not notice any troubling trends that follow racial or other demographic lines. And Denise, I don't know if you had any further thoughts on that, because I know you worked a lot on that section of the report.
Yeah, so I agree. I do think, again, one of our recommendations is just for the agency to improve its the analysis, the reporting, tracking, and use of force. So digging deeper into that issue is something that definitely the agency will be able to better do once they implement that recommendation.
Commissioner, I would say one of the things that I tell elected officials and chiefs and sheriffs all around the country, go anywhere in the world, go anywhere on the planet Earth, show me the neighborhoods where people are poor, are marginalized, are disenfranchised, lack opportunity, healthcare, public transportation, good food, whatever the race, ethnicity, background of those people, those are the neighborhoods where the police respond most, and those are the neighborhoods where police are least trusted. If we go back to the middle of the 19th century United States, there was high mistrust in the Irish community against police. And so if you look across history in the United States and any other country, we need to identify communities where trust is low, often with good reasons, and work to build that trust. So I would say this, even though we did not notice or identify disparities in use of force patterns, that does not mean that the sheriff's office should not be making an affirmative, proactive effort to build trust in communities of color, among low-income communities, among any and all communities who sadly have good reason historically to have weaker relationships with police departments than they could or should.
Anything else, Commissioner Fye?
Sheriff Garrett has his hand up.
Thank you, Chair Harrington. Thank you, Commissioner Fye. Our enforcement use of force report, which we publish annually, is very comprehensive. And you do see an overrepresentation of most of our communities of color in the force used category. Now, be really careful how I say this, but I'm just going to be just as honest with you as I am every time we talk. The overrepresentation is not significant, but if you're that community, any overrepresentation is significant. We get that. The jail use of force report is not as, and this is what Denise was alluding to in part, it's not as robust or comprehensive because we have not benefited from a accreditation body like the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, or CLIA, like we have on the patrol side and the enforcement side. That has really forced us in a good, positive way to develop a very comprehensive report that includes those disaggregated numbers. We are diving deep this year, in part in response to these recommendations, to do that very same thing for our jail use of force report. That's going to take us a few years to come up to the level that we have on our enforcement report, but it's moving in the right direction. And we already plan to address those numbers, to talk about those numbers, to hear from our community through our community-led advisory groups, in addition to other community gatherings like what we're working with Polos to achieve.
Thank you, Sheriff. I turn it back to you, Chair Harrington.
All right. Well, thank you, commissioners. I have a few comments and a couple of questions. But first, I want to start with some thank yous. I want to start with Sheriff Garrett. Thank you. Once again, I say it a lot. You're an awesome sheriff. And the culture that you have helped foster in the department is one of being a continuous learning organization. Uh, it it shows. It shows to me. It shows to our community. So I appreciate your willingness to seek this input and for everyone on your team for being open to it. I want to thank Polis for this report. It's very well done. You know, I read the packet in advance of this meeting, first read the slides, then started reading the report. And I thought, oh boy, there's a lot of pages here, but it was really approachable. I really benefited from the way you categorized the recommendations and the clarity on the recommendations. It wasn't off-putting for a Jane Q elected official like myself. I really learned a lot, and your recommendations are clear and actionable. And I suggest to everyone in our community, please read the report. The 71 recommendations are genuine to this agency, to our community. This was not just some paper exercise, right? This was not Polis taking some report on best practices that could be applied to any community USA. They really dug into our Washington County Sheriff's Office. So thank you very much. With the nature of the engagement, the community engagement that this Board of Commissioners has had since 2019, we have heard from some different voices. So for example, you've been very clear that in this effort, you did reach out for community engagement, but a lot of folks didn't respond. I would hope that with the community workshop moving forward, that members of Cairo, the Council of American Islamic Relations, will participate, as well as Sunrise Beaverton, because they are members of each of those groups who have given us feedback in 2019, but more so in 2020. And we have tried to engage with them through our Board of Commissioner workshops too. I have a couple more comments, but I have two very specific questions that I'm hoping you can enlighten all of us on, particularly given some of the history of seeing the city of Portland dealing with a federal consent decree, if I'm using the right phrase, as well as some additional city commission debates that they've had in the public service space. It caused me to try and ensure that in learning from this material, that I also thought about it from a viewpoint of skepticism. So towards that end, I'm wondering, given the scope of this, particularly as represented on page 6 and page 2, page 6 and page 10, could you tell us how you would answer the fact or the question, how can you provide actionable recommendations if it is beyond your scope to analyze overall trends in relationship to the nature and frequency of use of force?
So that's a great question, Chair. Thank you for that. To be clear, and this is a nuanced distinction, but I think it's an important one. We looked carefully at all the Sheriff's Office statistics on use of force. We look back 5 years on the use of force reports, and Particular thanks to the Sheriff's Office for giving us updates in real time for the 2021 report so we could finish this report on time. What we did not want to do is take limited money and rerun all the numbers and go back and spend hours poring over reports and looking for either correcting or affirming those 5 years of data. So we did look at the data. And based on a review of what the Sheriff's Office collects and reports, we did not see any red flags. To the second part of your question, I think that based on everything we collected, hundreds of documents, community interviews, agency interviews, we were able to get both an evidence base as well as an intuitive feel for what goes on in the Sheriff's Office. And I stand by the recommendations. I think they're actionable, and I don't think they would have. I don't think the recommendations would have been stronger if you'd given us another $100,000 to rerun all the Sheriff's Office numbers on use of force. I don't think that would have changed the outcome. I recognize there will be skeptics, and Chair, I really appreciate your kind words about the readability of the report, because we write it so that it appeals to a diverse audience. We want it to be readable by a deputy, by a high school citizen, or by a high school senior, by someone whose first language may not be English. We want it to be readable. We want it to be accessible. And we've also put language throughout the report meant to both affirm and challenge different positions. So we've put some things in there where we know line deputies are going to be rankled. They're going to say, well, wait a minute, come on, Sheriff, why did they put this in the report? Right? We're pushing back on the line deputies and saying, hey, folks, it's 2022. It's time to change culture. And to be honest, we also put things in there meant to educate the community and say, look, I know we all wish the world were perfect. We all have utopian dreams, but guess what? Use of force is not going to vanish from policing. The police are going to have to hurt people sometimes, just like in medicine.
Yeah,
We all wanna go to
but the hard part I'm preparing for.
Yes.
Really, this isn't my view, but I'm trying to be prepared for different viewpoints. Is there are places in your report where you're clear that your scope did not include practices, and in a few places where it does say you look at practices. And so there's a little bit of a mixed message there. So that's what I'm struggling with. So
Chair, I want to be sure I understand your question. So we did look at practice. I think what you're saying is that it was outside our mandate to look at individual events.
and as you have verbally articulated that, yes,
Right.
but in a couple of places you said, and not practices in specific instances or in fields. So I just want to highlight that as something that I saw that others may have a question about as you move forward, for example, with the workshop.
Right.
That's all.
Right. No, I appreciate that.
Yeah, because I don't have an answer, a good, consistent answer for that.
No, I hear you. Thank you for the point, Chair.
Another one of the questions that I had as I started to read the report, you answered for very well, both in the report as well as in the presentation, talking about a culture of necessity versus not merely of permissibility. And I really appreciated that teaching moment for all of us. And I think that's one that we need to make sure is conveyed moving forward. So I just have a few quick comments, and this is the biggest one. You paid a huge compliment to our leadership and personnel in the Sheriff's Office, especially our deputies. I hope that they see very clearly on page 13, the bottom paragraph, the huge compliment that you paid. And I hope they hear it, they see it, and they know it. And I leave it to all of the team to check that out. It's a small reference, but I believe it speaks volumes. And my last question is really one where I'm hoping you can help clarify for us. how do you view the Board of Commissioners in our role through all of this? Partner, stakeholder, or whatnot?
So I certainly don't want to pretend to a knowledge of the political intricacies of Washington County that I don't have. At the same time, elected officials, of course, provide a conduit for support, both political and financial, for what the sheriff's office needs to do. And so I will say in candor and transparency, just as there are messages in there for the line level deputies, for the community, I think there are messages in there for elected officials. And that is that some of these recommendations are easy and cheap. Some of them are hard and expensive. And I leave it to the sheriff and leadership to work through with the commission how to fund some of these recommendations. Because and this is frankly where also Washington County has a supportive community. You're not an impoverished community. You've got a good tax base. And many of the cities, many of the communities we work with, it breaks my heart because I know the money's not there. In other places we work with, money is spent hand over fist settling litigation. I know cities that literally spend tens of millions of dollars a year, tens of millions settling lawsuits, but their training programs are weak. And so I think the commission's role is to collaborate with the sheriff to make informed decisions about how to use scarce resources to squeeze the most value out of this report. Because I understand, I was just, to give you I keep giving these house analogies. My wife and I just had an energy audit done of our house. And of course, every contract you have come to your house would have you do 1,000 different things. And it would bankrupt you if you did them all. So, all right, I harbor no illusions that you can give the sheriff a blank check to do everything in that report. But I do think as the sheriff's office works through the recommendations, I think there will have to be, I would respectfully suggest, some honest conversations about where to spend money to get the most return on investment, to really, and part of that involves, for example, you've got a new body worn camera program. I can tell you around the country, most departments are squandering the opportunity to do more with body worn cameras. They're spending a lot of money on them. They're not using the data. Things like better and more equipment. We have a recommendation in there to deploy more less lethal tools to the field to try to reduce the possibility of having to shoot someone unnecessarily, something like that. But I think this, if the future conversations or anything like this, I think the county's in good shape. Denise, you probably have some thoughts above and beyond what I've said.
I completely agree with you, Jonathan. I'd also push you all are members of the community. So in that respect, providing your input, you're representing folks in your community as well. So being their voice when you can be will also be important to the process. So.
Yeah, and Chair, just a quick footnote I would add. You've got a great sheriff's office, right? No law enforcement agency is perfect, right? If there was, I'd be unemployed if law enforcement agencies couldn't be improved. But I would say, I think it could redound to the county's political benefit to talk about the success of this report and also to look at some of the recommendations, right? Because you've got, so some of the recommendations are aspirational. This is back to the 71. And this is why we said don't correlate the number of recommendations to the health of the organization. You've got a state-of-the-art training center that is the envy. Track from Chicago, second largest department in the country. He was drooling over your training facility, the likes of which Chicago has nothing, even though they have 14,000 officers. So there are recommendations in there about building partnerships with industry, with the academic world, turning that training center into a center of excellence. You truly can put yourselves in a national spotlight, because I wish I could bottle and distribute nationally some of what you're doing in Washington County.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And part of the reason why I asked you that question is because, I have always been and continue to be invested in those honest conversations. And this board, since I've been chair, has invested and is interested in seeking best practices, to learn, to adopt, and to pursue advanced techniques. And that includes our investing in alternative techniques so that our deputies don't have so many social ills to have to cope with. And so it isn't a decision about investing in the sheriff's office or in other things. We have finally, as a board, turned the corner, and we are investing to address the extensive needs of our homeless community, to make sure that we are providing for more affordable housing. And we're on a positive path together. But time is our most precious commodity. And that's often something that we as elected officials, in having our limited time through our terms, are trying to weigh how much community progress can we make in these outcomes within the course of time that we have. So once again, this has just been tremendous. Compliments to you, to Sheriff Garrett, your leadership team, and all members of the department. I'm grateful for the community members who were able to participate, and all of us on the board who took the opportunity to participate in the interviews with Polis as well. So we're running short on time. Are there any last words that Sheriff Garrett, you and the Polis team would like to make?
Thank you, Chair Harrington. I would just say we are staring a strategic plan update in the face, and this project is going to be center stage in part of our strategic plan going forward. And I look forward to updating you and getting your input as well. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Wender and Ms. Rodriguez.
No, thank you very much, Sheriff. We've really enjoyed working on the project. It's really been an honor and a privilege and a pleasure. And Denise, I'll give the last word to you.
No, again, my thanks. Certainly appreciate all of the effort.
Well, thanks for investing the time and digging into all that data too, and giving us your expertise.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you
Be
very
well.
much.
Take care.